Well, it is a great honor to be here, especially given my young academic career so far, being with so many senior scholars in this field that I admire and have written about. Meeting His Holiness the Dalai Lama, certainly the high point of my career thus far, and surely for the next years. It's a great pleasure now to give this talk. Now, I'm sorry for having missed some sessions yesterday. I'm afraid the same affliction has befallen me as Nick Humphrey. But being in pain is in theme with the conference, and the painkillers are helping me feel better as time goes by. So let us start with this talk. I'm going to talk as well about consciousness and evolution, though less about defending a specific thesis, more like a general framework for how we can integrate all this research going on in this room. And one thing that I thought was very nicely, as I learned more about Buddhism during this conference, that my talk, perhaps out of the three on evolution, is going to be the most adjacent to Buddhism. All right, let us begin. Now, as you mentioned, my monograph, Philosophy for the Science of Animal Consciousness, is going to appear next month, and this talk will be more or less structured according to those chapters. Now, there's two objectives, both my book and this talk. Firstly, I want to argue for the need and possibility of an evolutionary bottom-up approach to the science of consciousness that addresses the problem of consciousness in terms of the evolutionary origins of a new ecological lifestyle that made consciousness worth having. Sometimes consciousness is talked about as being almost this epiphenomenal state, but I think from an evolutionary perspective, we must treat consciousness as a costly investment that has somehow to pay off for organisms. It must be a trait that could perhaps under some circumstances be worth losing as well. The second objective is to articulate a thesis and beginnings of a theory for the place of consciousness as a complex, evolved phenomenon in nature that can help us to answer the question of what it's like to be a bat, an octopus, or crow. A lot of the talks here have focused on the question whether some animals are conscious, but I think the much more important question perhaps is what the actual experiences consist in. Now, because I couldn't summarize my book better than citing Peter Singer and Franz de Waal on my back cover. Peter Singer describes a philosophy for the science of animal consciousness as follows. Walter Veit argues for a more thoroughly Darwinian approach to understanding how consciousness has come into existence and in which beings it is to be found. By shifting the focus away from human consciousness, he helps us to understand the diversity of forms of consciousness that exist in other animals. Perfect. I wouldn't praise myself that highly, but thanks, Peter. Franz de Waal, who many of you surely know, is one of the pioneers in cognitive ethology, studying primates, says the a priori assumption that human consciousness differs from that in other animals has become hard to defend. In an eye-opening account, Walter Veit explains why. As a true philosopher, he delves into both the richness and ambiguity of the concept of consciousness. Now, why is there a raven on this cover? I spent some time during the writing process of this book as a philosopher in Nikki Clayton's Comparative Cognition Lab, work many of you might be familiar with. She is perhaps one of the most famous researchers who studies episodic memory and corvids and has given us insights into perhaps how they experience time, although I won't talk too much about this here. Now, in her foreword to my book, she describes it as, this book is a fascinating read for anyone who is interested in questions about consciousness from a biological and psychological perspective. It is also of great appeal to a much broader audience, which of course fits with the theme of the conference. It will be interest also to Buddhist scholars. There's those who are interested in the interdisciplinary nature of cognition and consciousness, those who adhere to the importance of philosophy in addressing scientific issues, and those who promote other interdisciplinary endeavors, such as the integration of science, arts, and the humanities, to address big picture questions about awareness of being, the questioning of realities, the subjective experience of seeing, feeling, doing, and thinking. Right? With all this praise out of the way, let me defend my actual ideas. Now, the goal of this talk primarily will be to make progress on the question of what it is like to be an animal by returning us to the insights of Donald Griffin's cognitive ethology. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, he discovered bat echolocation, which at the time was seen very skeptical among various scientists. And he had to work very hard to convince scientists that bat could echolocate. And this resistance towards progress in understanding the cognitive complexity of animals has convinced him that we might also be too skeptical about animal consciousness. And he argued we need a cognitive ethology that can, similarly to how ethologists Darwinized behavior into biology, Darwinize the minds of animals into a complete biology. And I think this is very much the goal of our meeting here. Now, while highly constrained laboratory experiments are important to understand animal consciousness, they are not enough. Ethologists emphasize that we also need to understand how animals live in a natural environment. We need to understand what consciousness does there. Only then can we ask important questions about what the adaptive value of these activities would be. That is, we need to study consciousness, like all biological phenomena, through a Darwinian lens. Ruth Millikan, a very influential philosopher, has made a nice comparison here with the ethologists criticizing the behaviorists almost like trying to study animals, like a researcher that tries to investigate a washing machine underwater. You won't develop a good understanding of it in this context because this is simply not the context for which it is designed. And we want thus to have a firm understanding of what consciousness does in nature for animals. So Konrad Lorenz once argued, if you confine yourself to the Skinnerian technique, you study nothing but learning apparatus, and you leave out everything that is different in octopi, crustaceans, insects, and vertebrates. In other words, you leave out everything that makes a pigeon, a rat, a man, and above all, a healthy man healthy and a sick man sick. Why this importance of health? Because we cannot make sense of pathological states in animals without thinking about the natural environments they're living in and for which they have evolved. Only in this context does it make sense to think about the design of animals, which will be important for this talk. So in order to develop a true biological science of consciousness, we must attend to the cognitive ethologist's demand to address the functionalist question of what consciousness does in all of its diversity and gradations. For healthy agents within the normal ecological lifestyles and the natural environments they have evolved in. I'm going to emphasize in this talk very much this idea of consciousness being not one single all or nothing trait that animals either possess or not, but rather a complex multidimensional phenomenon for which we need to design a lot of different tests that can expand our understanding of what animals actually experience. So I will defend the following thesis here, which I've called the pathological complexity thesis, which states the function of consciousness is to enable the agent to respond to pathological complexity, where pathological complexity is defined as the teleonomic, you can understand as goal-directed complexity of alternative life history strategies in the pursuit of survival and reproduction. All species have their own unique life history strategies with which they deal with the trade-offs in the natural environments. Whether they focus, for instance, on faster running, but then having to invest in more muscles, which is very costly. And basically you can treat all questions of biological design in terms of these trade-offs. Now, what is this doing here? Well, as a self-described cognitive ethologist, I was happy that Anindya Sinha mentioned that the macaques vary in both their personalities and life history strategies. Indeed, I think this is a very important insight. Subjective experience is intimately connected to the life history strategies of different animals, but so far we actually didn't talk that much about this, even though it would contextualize a lot of the experimental research we do on all kinds of animals, whether these are octopuses, rats, bats, and the like. So by drawing on life history theory, we will be able to remove humans from the center of consciousness studies and develop a non-anthropocentric evolutionary bottom-up approach to the study of consciousness. Now, many will think this is impossible. We only have an insight into human consciousness, so we inevitably have to build theories based on the human case, and then we just apply them to other animals. But for animals evolutionary very far from us, this is inevitably not going to work and might lead us to not being able to appreciate the phenomenological complexity of different animals that might have richer experience in some domains than even us humans. Obviously, bats can echolocate, dogs can smell much better than us. So this will be one of the key insights here. So Donald Redfield Griffin once argued, most of Darwin's basic ideas about evolution are now generally accepted by scientists. But the notion that there has been evolutionary continuity with respect to conscious experience is still strongly resisted, and overcoming this resistance may be the final crowning chapter of the Darwinian revolution. With this talk, I want to move us some more steps towards this final crowning chapter. So when we look at the natural world and we see all kinds of different animals, it is clear that they live completely different lives. But how could we even answer the question of where consciousness here can be found? When we ask about the place of mind in nature, there's two questions we can ask. One, how is matter and mind related? The more metaphysical question. And then secondly, where are the literal locations of minds in the natural world? So we can find this wild sweep of alternatives in nature, a phrase I borrow from Peter Godfrey Smith, where we seem to find a striking difference between systems without any sort of conscious experience, like Australian bushfires, the plants that succumb to them. I know some will object to this. Robots, bacteria, our planet, other stars, and the universe as a whole. In those systems, like humans, for which there is something it is like to be there, as almost take for granted. When we ask whether there is something it is like to be a bat or any other living system, for that matter, we are asking both whether they have subjective experiences of any kind and what these experiences consist in exactly. Yet, how could we possibly learn about this elusive phenomenon, especially when we think about non-human animals? After all, we can't ask them directly. So skepticism remains common. In fact, Thomas Henry Huxley's criticism very much still holds true for many scientists when he argued that what consciousness is, we know not, and how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp in the story, or as any other ultimate fact of nature. Now, Jennifer Maher nicely talked about consciousness as something she didn't want to talk too much about in terms of the term being ill-defined, and she didn't want to make claims about something that she doesn't think is actually a well-defined phenomenon. And I think we can see this in the talks here as well, but one way of resolving this problem is to simply accept that consciousness is not as one single trait, but it comes in terms of phenomenological complexity. And when we think about the most minimal forms of sentient beings, this might have almost no resemblance to the rich consciousness perhaps we find in humans. It is absolutely fine for consciousness to be transformed over evolutionary time to perhaps look very different in us than in a shrimp. So the so-called emergence of a science of consciousness in the 1990s has at best been a science of human consciousness. But to have a true biological science, we need to overcome this resistance to putting animals at the center. After all, humans are a mere special case when it comes to consciousness. They are just, at least if consciousness is widely shared in the natural environment, they are just one tiny proportion, and we shouldn't emphasize them in our theories too much. So for much of the 20th century, Western scientists saw consciousness as a unique human kind of self-awareness, an all-or-nothing property which hindered animal welfare productions. And perhaps we can nicely see in the discussions of Buddhism in its relation to sentience that a more progressive stance that quite nicely resembles where consciousness science is moving now in the West. Now, there have been a lot of books written in the recent times on animal consciousness, and we are moving away from the skepticism towards having a true biological science, but progress is happening slowly. Buddhists, nevertheless, have long recognized that there are different levels of consciousness. They don't treat consciousness as a all-or-nothing property necessarily. As we've seen, they talk about gross consciousness in terms of pleasure and pain being very central. And in fact, I believe that this is where the origins of consciousness reside. Similarly, Buddhists have long recognized that sentient beings matter in terms of being capable of pleasure and pain. They matter morally. It doesn't matter whether they have language or metacognitive representations. What matters is whether they can suffer. So, to summarize, consciousness is a complex, multidimensional phenomenon that differs in varieties and gradations across the animal tree of life, just like any other complex biological trait. And this is what I call phenomenological complexity. Consciousness is importantly not just an on or off matter, So we won't have any single test that can decide whether an animal is conscious or not. So, to move on to chapter 2, how can we study phenomenological complexity? After all, if it is multidimensional, we need to think about it quite differently. Donald Griffin, who's obviously, in a sense, the idol of this book, to bringing his messages back into consciousness science, argued that subjective qualities and mental experiences have remained largely untouched by the Darwinian revolution, primarily for lack of effective methods for detecting them reliably in other species. Now we're making progress on this, let alone analyzing them by scientific methods. But in our present state of ignorance, we certainly cannot exclude the possibility that mental experiences, like other attributes of animals and men, exhibit continuity of variation and not typologically discrete, all or nothing qualities totally restricted to a single species. Unfortunately, he died before he could see the rise of consciousness science in the last decade, even though he was perhaps the most important pioneer. And sometimes he's forgotten, which is why I try to emphasize him here as a very important figure. So if you think about the most minimal state of consciousness, sometimes we talk about it in terms of sentience. Animal welfare scientists, for instance, deliberately resist the notion of consciousness and talk about sentience instead, because consciousness is this very muddled term that means very different things for different researchers. But how is sentience defined? Also in different ways in the literature. We can see 3 different definitions. One is the most basic kind of consciousness, one is the most evolutionary ancient kind of consciousness, and then there's this definition in terms of capacity to feel positive and negative valence. It's the affective side of experience. Now, which definition to choose won't be a problem here, because I'll simply endorse all 3. And note here the similarities to gross consciousness in Buddhism. So the Animal Sentience Journal that has been founded roughly 8 years ago has been very influential in creating us an interdisciplinary hub for researchers from different fields to get together and write about how we can have a science of animal consciousness. And there has been some progress. So the objective of animal sentience is to increase scholarly, scientific, and practical understanding of the capacity of non-human animals to feel, and species similarities and differences in what and how they can feel and why, which is very much the emphasis of this talk. I want to understand how we can study these differences. Sensations and perceptions, including pain and pleasure and the many varieties of emotions, are central to a feeling organism's quality of life. With the rapid growth in the study of mental states in both human and non-human animals, there's a need for a journal that specializes in this. And there's been great progress. Many of the people sitting here have published in this journal, whether as target articles or commentaries. Now, recall the framework Birch discussed yesterday about their review of sentience in cephalopod mollusks. So they've provided us with these 8 criteria, which I think are quite useful in making a case for convincing especially policymakers of protecting animals. But curiously enough, evolutionary thinking played not that much of a role in the paper. Now, some think evolutionary thinking is very speculative, so perhaps it's good to not include evolutionary theorizing too much in a paper like this that is meant to convince the general public. Nevertheless, evolutionary thinking provides us perhaps with the greatest advantages when we want to think about other animals. They are designed, and thinking about how natural selection has shaped them might be able to enable us to develop better research methods for studying them, especially as their experiences might come in different shapes. So 2 questions that are very important is, what are the advantages sentience provides for animals in their natural lives? And secondly, why not treat the evidence picture as reflecting gradations rather than differences in kind? Now, I've written 2 commentaries on this, and one important point I wanted to make is that perhaps we shouldn't think of sentience here as this on or off matter, but perhaps the gaps in evidence and the weaker evidence for some crustaceans just suggest that they have a less rich evaluative experience. Perhaps their experience comes in a lesser degree. And we need to think about the possibility of quasi-consciousness that perhaps wouldn't just satisfy our theories of consciousness, but for the intermediate stages in between, for animals evolutionary very far from us. So if animal sentience turns out to be a complex bundle of functional capacities, it will become obvious that sentience itself must be studied with a plurality of methods to understand its diversity as for any other biological trait. So all these tests might reveal us how rich the evaluative experience is in different animals. So doing so will constitute significant scientific progress and enable sentience research to directly impact our knowledge of how to improve animal welfare. After all, we don't just want to know which animals feel, but also what harms them and what makes them feel good. Now, there are the obvious cases like causing injuries to animals, but obviously animals have wants, feelings first. They can experience loneliness, at least in some cases. And in order to understand that, we need to develop a much better understanding of what their experiences are like. So the question that we have to switch away from is, do they feel, and towards what do they experience? And the plurality of methods we use to assess animal sentience isn't some kind of methodological flaw that we haven't yet found the one true method that we can just apply to animals, whether that is a mirror test or motivational trade-offs. But these simply reflect the fact that animal consciousness is multidimensional and will need a plurality of methods to study these. So there is no single decisive test here. Nevertheless, yesterday we had a very nice talk by Koda about cleaner fish being able to recognize themselves in a mirror. And this perhaps comes the closest, you might think, to something like a litmus test for a certain kind of experience. As we shouldn't treat it as a test for all experience, but at least if you think this kind of self-consciousness, self-awareness is something that can only evolve later, then perhaps we can treat it as a very good experimental paradigm. Nevertheless, how to think about such tests? Well, they provide us with evidence for the richness of consciousness in one of its dimensions. And Jonathan Birch has written a lot about the dimensions of consciousness, which I'll quickly move to. But here is a nice graph by Franz de Waal in a commentary article responding to Koda, where he argued that our typical understanding of conscious phenomena has been far too binary. It hasn't recognized the fact that the failure of some animals in some version of the mirror mark test might just be reflective that they haven't as rich of a self-experience. But that doesn't mean they have none. And instead we should think about it more as a gradual evolution of these capacities that will be richer in some animals and poorer in others, and depending closely on the life histories of animals. In the cleaner fish, of course, it is very important to notice spots that resemble parasites that they can feed off on. And this is how we could make progress here. So I'll briefly talk here about Jonathan Birch's paper, The Dimensions of Animal Consciousness, where they tried to move away from thinking about consciousness as this single thing. And they distinguished these 6 dimensions. One is perceptual richness, and can include different dimensions such as touch, smell, vision. We have evaluative richness, selfhood, which describes the mirror mark tests, but could also refer to theory of mind capacities, temporality and unity. I prefer to distinguish them as synchronic unity in terms of how experience are integrated in different animals, and then temporality in terms of how they experience time. And all these dimensions are important and will help us to develop a better understanding of how animals experience the world, right? So some animals might have a richer experience in one dimension while being poorer in another. And this will enable us to develop a richer understanding of animal experience. So we already possess a very broad range of tests to provide us with evidence regarding the richness of experience in different animals. They're not anything like an ultimate test for the level, but they're providing us with evidence that increase our confidence of where to locate animals in such a multidimensional picture. But what we lack is an evolutionary understanding of how they're related. And one of my goals here will be to reverse engineer consciousness by asking for its origins in one of these dimensions. Which dimension came first? I already hinted at the fact that I think sentience is the most basic capacity, evaluative experience being able to experience pleasure and pain, not as these discrete states, but rather any kind of positive or negative hedonic experience. And this is very much what I try to do here, a view that has been anticipated by George Romanes and Darwin himself. George Romanes, Eva Jablonka nicely introduced him as the discipline of Darwin, and he said, if we contemplate the subject, we shall find it difficult or impossible to imagine a form of consciousness, however dim, which does not present in a correspondingly underdeveloped condition the capacity of preferring some of its states to others. That is, of feeling a distinction between quiescence and vague discomfort, which, with a larger accession to the mind element, grows into the vivid contrast between a pleasure and a pain. I think, therefore, it is needless to say more in justification of the level on the diagram at which I've written these words. Now, I think there needs to be some more evidence than that, but certainly the intuition is shared by a lot of researchers as well as the general public. Recently there have been experimental philosophy studies where humans were asked whether they would attribute consciousness to a robot when it can report a color or a smell, which they denied. But when it came to evaluative capacities, something like the smell of a flower that's associated with a nice smell, or pains, damage, humans were much more comfortable with attributing consciousness to them, and so some philosophers have now criticized the notion that philosophers have this perfect introspective insight into what consciousness really is, and perhaps valence, hedonic valence, is a better way of understanding the most minimal kinds of conscious experience. So in this chapter, I go into the question of which of those dimensions can be reasonably treated as latecomer features of consciousness, whereas others are evolutionary, much more ancient. And I've also talked about this in a recent paper. So, as I argue, hedonic valence, sentience, is the most ancient capacity. Often in consciousness science, it is treated as a representational capacity that comes into place once sensory experience exists. It's a kind of positive feeling that later on helps organisms to make decisions. And I think this is the wrong way to think about it. After all, most representations in animal brains are unconscious. So saying that consciousness is a form of representation doesn't really explain why it is experienced. And the idea that different authors have defended here, that we can think about consciousness more of a sort of impulse, a strong preference towards something. And I argue that there's such a capacity, if it evolves in animals, could then quickly, over evolutionary time, become representationally enriched to make better distinctions about what is important to animals, what is costly, and then make trade-offs among them. Similarly, once felt sensory representations become richer in animals. A distinction between self and other will also inevitably emerge. A distinction between the own body, the environment, and different animals. And when it comes to the experience of time, how experiences are integrated in animals, I just don't think these need to be treated as anything like necessary properties of consciousness if you think about its most basic ancient evolutionary beginnings. Now let us turn towards the evolution of this capacity. Dan Dennett, who has been very influential for me here, argued that complexity is worth caring about, but not just any complexity. We need to answer the question, what kind of complexity is worth caring about, such that sentience is worth having as a trait that presumably costs something for the animal to invest in. Now, Eva Jablonka and Simona Ginsberg have written a commentary on a Target article I've wrote about this. I've written a response. I won't go too much into this here. But Dan Dennett once argued that what matters for complexity, for sentience, is the complexity of an autonomous, self-protecting, self-advancing, but mortal, vulnerable bit of machinery that gives us an explanation of why it is equipped to suffer and why its suffering matters to it. We need to answer that question. For much work going on in consciousness research, this question isn't really addressed. What does it do for the animal to have these experiences? If there isn't anything like a benefit, it is very questionable why they would have the experience to begin with. Now, originally I introduced this idea in a commentary to a Target article by Merker. where they criticize the idea of integrated information theory for a plurality of reasons. And I argued there's another reason why we can criticize this, which is it doesn't really explain what the adaptive benefit of consciousness is. It just treats consciousness more or less like a byproduct of information integration and organisms becoming more complex. Now, recall the pathological complexity thesis states that the function of consciousness is to enable the agent to respond to pathological complexity, the complexity of life history strategies. Now, in recent work, this is a preprint with some biologists at Oxford, I've worked on how we can measure this complexity, and because there's often questions about how we can understand this notion, here's some graphs. So when you think about a life history strategy that all organisms possess, it's a strategy they implement towards the goal of maximizing fitness. All life history strategies are defined by a schedule starting from the start of a life history, e.g. birth, fission, cloning, and this beginning is followed by a life history strategy that directs the individual towards a goal, whether it is lifetime reproductive output or inclusive fitness. And complexity can easily be understood as having alternatives. When organisms face more alternatives, the life history complexity is higher, and as organisms evolve richer behavioral capacities, they are obviously faced with many more choices, which leads to a complexity explosion in how they have to make these trade-off decisions between which actions to take. So Melker et al. Integrated pathological complexity as follows. Veit proposes that consciousness arose as a means for organisms to deal with what he calls pathological complexity. We assume that what he has in mind is the kind of complexity that arises in co-evolution and evolutionary arms races, say of the predator-prey kind, which became acute with the evolution of large image-forming eyes, hence this reference to the Cambrian explosion. Now, I think this is nice to point out because this is how many researchers argue how consciousness might have evolved in the Cambrian. There's rich sensory capacities and then consciousness comes along with them, alongside interactions with other animals. It is here that animals evolve a sense of a subject and different minds. Yet I think that this is perhaps already too distant, and we need to think about consciousness in the beginning as a more basic trait. As Buddhists emphasize, it is action, not interaction, that matters for consciousness. And they obviously emphasize that what matters for organisms is when they can move to have pleasure and pains in the sense of a common currency, perhaps, to make these evaluative trade-off decisions. This is what matters for the very origins of consciousness. Now, fitness is, of course, the ultimate common currency for difficult trade-off decisions in the Darwinian design space. The organisms we can see in the natural world all operate in the space of an optimality space, even if they're not at a perfect spot, obviously. We have fitness valleys where organisms can get stuck, and yet in the natural world we find this huge diversity of different strategies to maximize fitness. Now, hedonic valence is also a common currency. It evolved as a proximate common currency, however, to help organisms to deal with the trade-offs in animal decision-making. At some point in evolutionary history, animal capacities became so complex in how many options they have available that it became worthwhile to invest in a proximate common currency that can help organisms to make these difficult trade-off decisions. Marian Dawkins herself came very close to advocating an early version of the pathological complexity thesis, where she argued, animals usually have more than one kind of danger to avoid. They have complex trade-offs at all levels in order to minimize reductions of fitness in facing a wide range of threats. At different times of the day or year, or depending on external circumstances, they will reallocate priorities. For example, animals may depress or enhance their immune responses, increase or decrease the physiological stress responses, or find some stimuli more or less aversive. Think of how good of some particular food item tastes if you've not eaten anything for many hours, right? Subjective experience isn't reflecting some objective state in the natural world, but it is highly dependent on the animal and its life history strategy. Where is it in the moment in an optimal space? If an animal is starving, food will become much more important. It will be much more important to experience a strong sensation of hunger. So just like Ivrea Blanca and Simona Ginsberg, I see the dawn of sentience as something appearing alongside the Cambrian explosion 541 million years ago. It is here that we saw this explosion of animals gaining action capacities. And alongside those, richer sensory capacities, because they would immediately pay off. Organisms would better know where to move if they can see a predator somewhere or nutrition is somewhere else. Yet, I think it is a mistake, as I said, to associate consciousness here with the sensory capacity. I think sentience was a precondition for these complex behavioral capacities to evolve. After all, why didn't they evolve earlier? And why was there this rapid explosion? So I think of sentience as this common currency that evolved and suddenly gave rise to unlocking a vast space of the design space, as Dennett might describe it, where animals suddenly were able to explore many more options. And in the Cambrian, you could see how very different life history strategies were explored. And some of them were more optimal than others, of course. So pathological complexity became so high during the Cambrian explosion, it became worthwhile for organisms to approximately represent the fitness values of alternative actions. I don't like the term represent too much here, because it often is associated with much richer notions than I want to associate it here. I like to distinguish it more from a sensory representational states, and once you have sentience, this sentient capacity can become enriched such that organisms can better attach it to different environmental stimuli. But it helps organisms to continue to engage in one action over another. And when we think about the very minimal origins of consciousness, they of course have to be very poor. They don't have to be rich or very fine-tuned to fitness, as long as on average animals with this very basic capacity of sentience do better than others. Now, I'm most inspired here by Michel Cabernet, who has argued that pleasure is this common currency of decision-making. And he argued that consciousness evolved in terms of this common currency as well, although he thinks it's a much later evolutionary innovation, only to be seen in amniotes. Yet, given all this evaluative research we have done on, say, crustaceans, I think the case is much stronger now that this capacity is much more evolutionary ancient, with reward molecules like dopamine having a truly ancient evolutionary origins. McNamara and Houston, both emeritus professors at Bristol, argued that any attempt to understand behavior in terms of the evolutionary advantage that it might confer has to find a common currency for comparing the costs and benefits of various alternative causes of action. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be conscious necessarily. Organisms could use proxies like energy level, and yet that won't always be helpful when it comes to making complex evaluative trade-off decisions, such as whether to go out given that there might be predators compared to the current state of hunger levels, which kinds of energy are lacking. Schitzker and Conover similarly argued that in natural settings, the goals competing for behavior are complex, multidimensional objects and outcomes. Yet, for orderly choice to be possible, the utility of all competing resources must be represented on a single common dimension. So sentience evolves as a kind of natural utility that economists often talk about, though not satisfying economist criteria such as transitivity or completeness. The beginnings of sentience don't look like this at all. In fact, human evolution has become, in a sense, a move away from sentience as the basic capacity for decision making, where humans can engage in different kinds of decision making. Think of thinking fast and slow by Kahneman, where they have a more abstract form of making these evaluative decisions. Nevertheless, the two capacities are related and often conflict, because in the human case, decisions often operate across time. So to move to chapter 5, how can we use this framework to explain phenomenological complexity? What behaviorists excluded from the narrow circle of the interest is not only other learning process, but simply everything that is not contained in the process of learning by reinforcement. This neglected reminder is neither more or less than the whole remaining organism. What remains uninvestigated is all that makes an octopus, a pigeon, a rat, or a man, and most important of all, what makes a healthy man, and an unhealthy man, a patient. The emphasis on health, because we can only understand what's natural for organisms in the natural environments. Although this sounds a bit elusive, but there is a very sensible message in here. So in a recent paper, I've argued that we can use this framework to think about sentience in insects, crustaceans, and also gastropods. Gastropods are perhaps the new line of defense, where skeptics argue, look, it makes no sense for them to have conscious experience, yet we haven't done a lot of experiments on their evaluative capacities, so as we learn more about this, we will gain a richer understanding. And yet, to think about these questions, we have to think about the natural lifestyles. Despite the fact that gastropods look so simple and slow, there are very different life history strategies. Some gastropods can swim and are very flexible in their movement and choices, whereas others live perhaps more slow lives. Nevertheless, speed shouldn't be taken as a proxy for the absence of consciousness. So animal consciousness science lacked a way of generating reliable predictions and tests, and the pathological complexity framework solves both problems. A deep understanding of a species' life history complexity from a study of the natural lives will allow us to generate evolutionary plausible hypotheses that make sense, where we can ask why it would be beneficial for the animal to have this capacity. And these can then in turn be tested in the lab. Conversely, tests for different forms of phenological complexity can allow us to make predictions regarding the life history pressures of species in the natural environments, which again can be tested. So consciousness science lacked this bidirectional approach, where we have little way of actually verifying our claims about consciousness. Yet here, in thinking about adaptive benefits, and testing them in different animals, say how rich their evaluative capacities are, we can then move on to test animals in their natural lives, investigate different hypotheses about the different pathological complexity pressures to understand them better. So, to move towards the conclusion, Donald Redfield Griffin once stated, "Granting that hypotheses about animal minds are difficult to test by currently available procedures, the tentative consideration of their plausibility might pave the way for thoughtful ethologists to devise improved methods to study when and where animal consciousness may occur and why its content may be. The future extension and refinement of two-way communication between ethologists and the animals they study offer the prospect of developing in due course a truly experimental science of cognitive ethology." So just as the ethologists Darwinized behavior by thinking about its adaptive value of organisms in their natural lives, we can do the same for consciousness. This is no easy task, but it is very important to make progress in the science and move away from a model that emphasizes humans. So we can think here about gastropods and their lives, bees, as Lars Chitka, of course, argued. Recently it has been shown that they can engage in these important trade-off decisions where motivations conflict with each other. And no one thought bees could do this, and yet they are able to very well trade off the value of, say, a sucrose solution versus the pain they might receive, the damage of the platform, whether that is heat or something else. And this suggests that even insects have something like a hedonic common currency that enables organisms to make these difficult trade-off decisions, and it pays off for organisms to have this capacity. Similarly, octopuses, that seems so strange when it comes to consciousness. What might the experiences be like? When we think about a pathological complexity framework, it is clear that their life histories are extremely complex. They have to make very difficult trade-off decisions all the time. They're not like organisms that have a simple shell that makes the life history much more simple, where they can simply retract into it. No, they have to find safe spaces to hide themselves and the like. So octopuses might be even a case for an extreme level of pathological complexity, which can help us to explain what their selfhood capacities might be like, how they distinguish their arms from each other, and so forth. So to conclude, Donald Griffin once stated, "I am confident that with patience and critical investigation, we can begin to discern what life is like, subjectively, to particular animals under specific conditions. Cognitive ethologists can certainly improve greatly on these preliminary inferences once the creative ingenuity of scientists is directed constructively towards the important goal of answering Nagel's basic question, what is it like to be a bat or any other animal?" And many of the researchers here have done this. You have designed great tests towards enabling us to better explore what the subjective experience of animals is like. So to conclude, there's 3 lessons. Firstly, phenomenological complexity, that is the diversity and gradations of consciousness across the animal branch of life, should be our focus. Not mere tests for the presence or absence of consciousness, if it was a single trait, is a complex, multidimensional phenomenon. Secondly, locating the origins of consciousness in sentience, hedonic feelings, substantially narrows the explanatory gap between matter and mind and can explain the other dimensions of consciousness without explanatory leftovers. Now, I didn't go into this in this talk, but when we try to build a theory of consciousness on one of the other dimensions, it always seems like there's an explanatory leftover, which gives rise to this idea of a hard problem of consciousness, an explanatory gap that cannot be bridged. Yet, when we think about sentience becoming representationally enriched, gaining greater sensory capacities, then giving rise to this distinction between self and other, experience being organized in different forms, being more or less unified, both in a moment or across time, consciousness makes sense. So the last point, a deep understanding of the pathological life history complexity animals are faced with will allow us to remove humans from the center of reference in consciousness and develop a true biological science of consciousness with ecologically relevant tests. After all, think of the hippo. As Colin Allen once argued, it simply makes no sense to give a mirror mark test to a hippo given its natural lives, because they're obviously muddy and don't care about spots on their body. So in order to design good tests, we have to be thinking very carefully about what their natural lives are. And when we think of the cleaner fish, of course, they have a great life history to investigate these capacities. And this will be the challenge for future research. We have to develop species-sensitive tests. So thanks for your attention.